The email arrived at 7:42 a.m. on a Wednesday, right between my first sip of coffee and the sound of the office elevator humming somewhere below my apartment. The subject line read, "Your reference letter is ready." I remember thinking how nice it felt just to see those words. They looked like closure. The morning light was warm, stretching across the counter, catching the edge of my mug. The kind of calm that makes you think the world is briefly in your favor. I clicked the attachment. It opened fast, almost impatiently, and then nothing. Just a flawless white page, no header, no greeting, no signature, only a file name that said, Recommendation Final.pdf. Professional, precise, and completely empty. For a moment, I stared at it, waiting for the text to fade in, as if kindness might load more slowly than the rest of the document. I refreshed, downloaded it again, reopened it in another app. Still blank. My stomach didn't drop. It settled. There are disappointments that hurt, and there are disappointments that confirm what you already suspected. This was the second kind. My name is Ellen Moore. I'm 47, and I've worked in corporate marketing for 14 years. Long enough to know the difference between being valued and being convenient. I had spent most of those years inside the same company, the same gray glass building, the same carpet that smelled faintly of toner and overused ambition. I ran campaigns, mentored 20-plus new hires, stayed late on Fridays, hit every deadline. And somehow, in the process of being reliable, I became invisible. When I told my boss, Dan, that I was leaving, he looked at me with the polished sympathy of a man who'd practiced it in mirrors. "Ellen," he said, "you've been the backbone of this team. I'll make sure your next company knows that." I believed him. I wanted to. Because believing someone values you is easier than facing the truth that they don't. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I'd watched him write 2 glowing letters for the men I trained, both 5-minute favorites, both already boasting new job titles on LinkedIn. I told myself mine was coming, maybe tomorrow, maybe Monday. And then it came, blank, like the space where my recognition should have been. I printed the PDF anyway. The paper slid out smooth, warm from the printer, almost mocking in its perfection. I placed it on my desk beside my silver pen, the one I'd had since my first contract 12 years earlier. A gift from my mentor who'd said, "Keep this, you'll sign great things." I rolled it between my fingers, feeling the faint groove my thumb had made over the years. Around me, the apartment was silent except for the clock, ticking through what felt like the end of something. I looked at that blank page and thought, this is what loyalty looks like when it's been formatted into nothing. 14 years condensed into pure white space. A career rendered invisible in PDF form. And then, quietly, a different thought arrived. Smaller, steadier, stronger. If he won't write my story, I will. It wasn't rage, it was realization. The kind that straightens your spine instead of tightening your fists. I opened a new document, typed one line, reference letter, Ellen R. Moore, and stared at it until the cursor blinked like a pulse. This time, there would be no adjectives, no borrowed praise. Only truth, facts, numbers, the things that don't disappear when people forget to notice you. I took another sip of coffee, colder now, and smiled to myself. The page on my screen might still be empty, but unlike his, mine wasn't a dead end. It was a beginning. The Monday after that email, I went to the office earlier than usual. It was strange walking through the quiet halls knowing I had already resigned, still doing my job out of habit. The building felt different when you knew it no longer owed you anything. The glass walls of the conference rooms reflected my image back at me. Steady posture, coffee in one hand, badge around my neck that would stop working in 2 weeks. A part of me wondered if anyone would even notice when it didn't beep anymore. Dan was already in his office, door half open, laughing into a call. I stood outside for a moment, listening. His tone was smooth, performative, the same one he used when clients were on the line. I caught fragments of sentences. Team player, great potential. I'm happy to recommend him. I knew that tone too well. It was the letter voice. I didn't need to see who he was talking about to know it wasn't me. He was probably writing another glowing endorsement for one of the new faces, the ones who stayed late exactly once and made sure everyone saw it. I walked to my desk, logged in, and checked my email. No apology from him, no follow-up, just a forwarded invite to a farewell celebration for another department. I smiled, not bitterly, just tired. My departure hadn't even earned a group lunch. 14 years, and I was leaving as quietly as a tab being closed. Throughout that week, I noticed small things I'd never really seen before. The way people stopped including me in project threads. How meetings I used to lead were suddenly restructured. The way my seat in the weekly sync had been moved from beside Dan to the far end of the table. None of it was cruel. It was worse than that. It was polite, sanitized. The kind of distancing that hides behind smiles and HR-approved language. One afternoon, I overheard two co-workers outside the break room. One whispered, "She's leaving, right?" The other replied, "Yeah, I think Dan's writing her letter." They both laughed, not meanly, but knowingly. I didn't interrupt. I just waited until they left, poured myself a cup of coffee, and looked at the calendar pinned above the machine. 10 days left. 10 days to finish the work, clear my desk, and disappear neatly, like I was never really there. But the thing about being quiet for too long is that it makes people forget how much you've seen. I remembered every project, every campaign, every late-night deck that carried someone else's name at the top. I remembered fixing budgets, correcting reports, training interns who now called me ma'am, like I was part of the furniture. I remembered Dan once saying, "You make it look too easy, Ellen. That's your problem." Maybe he was right. Maybe I did. That night, I opened my laptop at home and started going through old folders. Campaign data, revenue reports, client, emails, everything I'd built, stored neatly, documented over years. I didn't even know why I was doing it at first. Maybe I just wanted to remind myself that my work existed. But as I scrolled, something shifted. The numbers formed a pattern, one that told a clearer story than any reference letter ever could. Every project, every client gain, every milestone had my name somewhere in the version history. My proof was already there. All I had to do was write it. The next morning, I brought a small USB drive with me. I kept it in my pocket, a quiet promise. I didn't need revenge. I needed record. I didn't want them to regret what they'd done. I wanted them to remember what I had. Because that's what fairness looks like when you stop waiting for permission. It looks like documentation. As I left the office that day, I passed Dan in the hallway. He smiled and said, "Still good for your exit interview next week?" I said, "Absolutely." And for the first time in years, I didn't feel small saying it. Because now, I wasn't leaving quietly. I was leaving with evidence. The 10th day crept up quietly. I was clearing folders, returning access cards, deleting years of notes from a shared drive that would soon forget my name. I told myself I was ready to leave, but small things kept cutting through the calm. People, asking where the old files were stored, who'd handled the analytics, who'd trained the interns. Every question had my fingerprints on it, and every answer left my name out. That afternoon, Dan called me into his office. He didn't look up from his laptop when he said, "Before you go, could you tidy up the campaign archive? The new team will need context." The new team, 2 people I'd trained last year. I stood there for a second, watching him type, watching his reflection in the glass. "Sure," I said, the words sounding more polite than I felt. When I left the room, I realized he hadn't once said thank you. I spent the rest of the day gathering files, but instead of deleting everything, I started to label it. Every report, every pitch deck, every note that showed the work behind the scenes. The deeper I went, the clearer the pattern became, how often my drafts became someone else's final version, how my slides were presented under another voice. By the time the sun slipped down the glass windows, my desk was a mosaic of evidence. Then came the moment that broke whatever patience I had left. HR sent out an email to the entire department. Congratulations to Steve M. for leading the award-winning North Haven campaign. I froze. That campaign was mine. I had built it from the ground up. Concept, data, client pitch, execution. Steve had joined 2 weeks before launch. The email was polite, celebratory, completely wrong. And I realized that blank PDF hadn't been an accident. It was the logical next step of a culture that feeds on quiet women doing uncredited work. I closed my laptop, packed my pen, and drove home without turning on the radio. The city blurred past in gold and gray. By the time I parked, the anger had already cooled into something sharper. Intent. I brewed tea, opened a clean document, and titled it again. Reference letter, Ellen R. Moore. This time, it wasn't going to be a plea for acknowledgement. It was going to be proof. 14 years of proof. I began listing numbers, dates, revenue growth, client retention rates, every metric that could speak where people hadn't. Line by line, the page filled with the record they refused to write. When I finished the first page, I sat back and looked at it. The data glowed on the screen, unemotional, undeniable. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't felt at work in years. Ownership. I wasn't waiting for Dan's approval, or HR's recognition, or anyone's signature. I was documenting my truth. And the numbers were doing the talking. That night, before closing my laptop, I whispered what would become my quiet rule from then on. If they won't tell the story right, I'll make sure the data does. And just like that, the revenge stopped being emotional. It became methodical. For the next 3 nights, I worked in silence. No music, no calls, just the low hum of my old laptop and the steady rhythm of typing. It was strange, how peaceful it felt to rebuild something that had once been taken apart. Me. I opened folders from years past, names of campaigns I could still recall by scent and color. North Haven, Astor Launch, Vanguard Q4. Each one carried memories of long evenings, missed dinners, small victories that had gone unrecorded. Now finally, I was recording them, I started building a list, column by column. On the left, the project name. Next to it, the year, the team, the measurable result. Every number I entered was a small reclamation of space. 126 campaigns, 8.3 million in total revenue, 24 junior marketers trained, 3 company awards, 0 disciplinary notes. Facts didn't need adjectives, and that was what made them powerful. They couldn't be argued with, or rewritten, or conveniently forgotten. I was done writing sentences that began with, I believe. From now on, everything would begin with, I delivered. At first, I thought this letter would just be for me, a way to leave with dignity. But as the pages filled, I realized it was more than that. It was a blueprint of how women like me survive in offices that run on selective memory. Every metric on that page was something I'd been told didn't matter as much as teamwork, which, in practice, meant as much as being liked. But the numbers didn't care if they liked me. The numbers told the truth. By the second night, I had crafted the opening paragraph. Ellen Moore served as Senior Marketing Manager from 2010 to 2024. During her tenure, she led data-driven campaigns that generated measurable impact across multiple divisions. Her approach combined precision, mentorship, and consistency, qualities that rarely draw attention, yet hold companies together. No exaggeration, no bitterness. Just precision. I wanted it to read like a mirror. Clean, reflective, impossible to distort. I formatted the document in the same company template Dan had used for his own letters. I matched the margins, the font, even the signature line, but instead of his name, I typed mine. At the bottom, I added a single line that would later make people pause. Ellen's professionalism is quiet, but measurable. When I looked at it all together, it felt complete, like a resume that had finally remembered its author. But I wasn't done. I drafted a brief email to the HR director of the company I was applying to. Attached is a factual record of my work over the past 14 years. It is not a recommendation. It is a reference of truth. I read it twice before hitting send. There was no anger in the words, just clarity. I didn't need their approval. I needed the truth to exist somewhere official. After sending it, I sat back in my chair, the silver pen still in my hand. I realized I hadn't used it to sign the document. I didn't need to. The facts had already signed for me. The pen wasn't a tool anymore. It was a witness. Outside, the city was quiet. I left the lights off, watching the faint glow from my screen reflect off the framed certificate on the wall, the only company award that had ever carried my name. I smiled. It wasn't much, but it was real. And real, I'd learned, was the best kind of revenge. 3 days after I sent the letter, I stopped checking my inbox. I didn't expect a response. It wasn't the kind of email that invited conversation. It was a document meant to stand on its own, evidence, not appeal. But on Thursday afternoon, as I was sorting through the last box from my desk, my phone buzzed. The caller ID said Megan D., HR Director at Halston & Co. That was the company I had applied to weeks earlier. I hesitated for half a second before answering. Her voice was calm but curious. "Ellen, we received your file," she said. "The letter." I braced myself, ready to explain why I'd written it that way. But she didn't sound critical. She sounded impressed. "I've been in HR for 17 years," she continued, "and I've never seen anything like it. It's honest. It's data-driven. It tells me exactly who you are without trying to sell me a story." There was a pause, the kind that fills with possibility. "Can I ask?" she said softly. "Did you really write it yourself?" I smiled, even though she couldn't see it. "Yes," I said. I figured honesty deserves to speak for itself. There was another pause, then laughter, warm and genuine. "That's refreshing," she said. "We'd like to move forward with you for the director position. Can you join us for a final interview next week?" When the call ended, I just sat there staring at my phone. I felt the stillness settle in. Not triumph, not relief, something quieter. Validation, maybe. The kind that doesn't need an audience. The next morning, word started to travel. I hadn't realized how quickly things moved in a small industry. By noon, I got a message from an old colleague. "Hey, did you really write your own reference letter? People are talking about it." Then another. "Someone forwarded your letter to our HR team as an example of transparency." I laughed, quietly, the way you do when justice takes an unexpected shape. Later that week, my old company had its quarterly town hall meeting. I wasn't invited, of course, but a friend still inside texted me afterward. "Dan looked pale," she wrote. "Your letter's been circulating. HR used it as a sample in their integrity training." I read the text twice, then put the phone down and let the irony wash over me. The same man who couldn't write a single sentence for me was now learning from mine. By Friday, I had an offer letter from Halston & Co. A real one, with numbers and signatures and words that carried weight. I printed it and placed it beside the old blank PDF still pinned to my corkboard. 2 documents side by side, one empty, one full. Together, they told the entire story of what it costs to be overlooked and what it means to reclaim yourself. When I packed up the last of my things from the old office, I didn't take much. Just my coffee mug, a framed photo from the first year, and the silver pen. As I walked out, I saw Dan at the end of the hall. He looked up, gave me that same easy smile, and said, "Good luck, Ellen." I stopped, turned slightly, and said, "You too, Dan. You'll need it." I didn't look back after that. Some collapses happen loudly, others quietly, but the quiet ones last longer. And as I stepped into the elevator, I realized that sometimes the cleanest revenge isn't destroying someone else's version of the story. It's publishing your own. When I joined Halston & Co., the first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not the kind of silence that hides discomfort, the kind that lets people focus. My new office was smaller than the one I had left, but the energy felt different. No one shouted to be heard. No one interrupted. People read, listened, wrote things down. After 14 years of trying to be seen, I had finally stepped into a place that valued observation over volume. On my first day, Megan, the HR director who had called me, stopped by my desk. She handed me a slim blue folder. Inside was my official title, Director of Strategy, Marketing Division. Below it, a line that said, Reports directly to Executive Board. I traced the letters with my finger before closing the folder. For the first time in years, my title felt like a reflection, not a favor. Within the first month, Megan invited me to a meeting about internal mentorship programs. We're building something new, she said, for women re-entering or restarting their careers after 40. We want someone who's lived through that experience, quietly, intelligently. I knew exactly what she meant. I said yes. The program started small, just 11 women, each from different departments, each carrying a different version of the same story. They weren't angry. They were tired of having to prove they still belonged in a room they helped build. I taught them how to track credit, document wins, and speak with data. No self-defense, no drama, just receipts. We called it the Quiet Power Project. One afternoon after a session, one of the women, her name was Karen, stopped by my office. She said, I read your letter. I blinked, surprised. It's been passed around, she said. Someone printed it and pinned it to the break room board. People are calling it the evidence letter. She smiled. It made me start writing mine. After she left, I opened my email and searched my own name. She was right. The document had spread, not virally but quietly, across industries and networks. Each week, a few new messages arrived in my inbox. Women thanking me, sharing their own evidence letters, telling me they'd finally documented their worth. It wasn't revenge anymore. It was replication. That night, I took out the blank PDF that had started it all, the one Dan had sent. It was still in my drawer, creased from being printed too many times. I looked at it for a long while before placing it inside a frame, next to my desk lamp. It wasn't a reminder of betrayal anymore. It was the proof of what happens when silence finds its voice. And when people asked me later how I managed to rebuild everything after leaving a company that forgot me, I always gave the same answer. I didn't rebuild. I just started keeping records, because sometimes the real reversal isn't when you make them see what they lost. It's when you finally see what you were worth all along. 9 months after joining Halston & Co., I was invited to speak at the National Leadership in Marketing Conference in Chicago. The topic was authenticity and accountability in corporate culture. I didn't think twice before accepting. By then, the evidence letter had taken on a quiet life of its own. A few HR directors had cited it in seminars, and someone even used a line from it in a university ethics paper. I wasn't famous, just quietly known, which is the only kind of recognition that ever lasts. The ballroom was large, paneled in glass and gray metal, filled with the hum of small talk and expensive perfume. I arrived early, carrying my silver pen like a small superstition. As I scanned the crowd, I saw him. Dan. He looked older, not physically, but in posture. His suit was sharper, his smile more practiced. He was standing near the buffet, surrounded by familiar faces from the old company. For a second, I felt that old reflex, the instinct to shrink, to stay unseen. Then I remembered who I was now, and that instinct passed like a shadow. After my panel, people gathered around to ask questions. I saw Dan waiting behind them, holding a coffee cup he wasn't drinking. When the crowd thinned, he stepped forward. "Ellen," he said, that same smooth tone he'd always used in meetings. "It's been a long time." "It has," I said. My voice sounded calmer than I expected. He smiled tightly. "I read your letter. The one you sent to Halston." I met his eyes. "Did you?" He nodded, looking off to the side. "It circulated internally. HR used it as a model in their transparency training." He let out a small laugh like he wanted to be in on the joke. You know that took some courage. I let the silence stretch. He was expecting warmth, forgiveness, something that would let him walk away with a clean conscience. But I wasn't there to give him that. Courage, I said finally, isn't writing a letter. It's realizing you don't need someone else's signature to make it valid. For the first time, he didn't have a rehearsed answer. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He nodded again, slower this time, as if acknowledging something he hadn't meant to. Before he could speak, an organizer approached to thank me for the talk. I smiled at her, then turned back to Dan and said, quietly enough that only he could hear, next time you forget someone's name on a document, remember, silence leaves a signature too. I walked away before he could reply. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt finished. The kind of peace that comes when the story ends exactly where it should. In truth, not revenge. As I left the hall, the pen slipped lightly against my palm, reflecting the afternoon light. For years, it had signed contracts, approvals, performance reviews. That day, it felt like it had finally signed closure. That night, after the conference, I returned to my hotel room overlooking the Chicago skyline. The city lights blinked faintly against the glass, each one a story, each one proof that something somewhere was still alive and working. I sat at the small desk, took the silver pen from my bag, and placed it next to the framed printout of my blank reference letter, the one I still carried with me. It had become my quiet compass, the reminder of what happens when you wait for someone else to define your worth. I poured a cup of tea and thought about the day. Dan's face, the audience's applause, the young women who had come up after my panel, one of them saying, "You made me start writing my own evidence file." I realized, with a slow smile, that my story had stopped being about revenge a long time ago. It had become something steadier, proof. Proof that silence, when shaped carefully, can outlast noise. I opened my laptop and scrolled to the final line of my evidence letter. It still read the same. Ellen's professionalism is quiet, but measurable. I whispered it aloud like a benediction. Then I added one more sentence, the only one that ever truly needed to exist. And when the record is complete, the truth doesn't need a signature. I still keep that blank letter on my desk, not as a reminder of what was missing, but of what I built instead. Because sometimes the story that was never written for you becomes the one everyone remembers. If you've ever been overlooked, if you've ever had to prove your own worth, tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one, because fairness doesn't shout. It stays. If this story spoke to you, give it a like. It helps more women find their voice again. And don't forget to subscribe to Office Revenge Files for more stories where women turn silence into power.